The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when the tension in the cabin became almost tangible. James Harris gripped the armrest of his seat so tightly that his knuckles whitened. The man across from him, impeccably dressed in a crisp suit that screamed privilege, was laughing loudly at his own jokes, oblivious to the cramped discomfort of the single father seated next to him. James had spent hours juggling the flight schedule, work emails, and the barely contained energy of his 6-year-old son asleep beside him, and now he was expected to endure this man's condescending amusement. "You're traveling alone with a child," the man said, leaning in, his voice dripping with incredulity. "Don't you have, I don't know, a nanny? Someone to help?" His eyes were sharp, assessing, mocking. James forced a polite smile, swallowing the irritation that flared in his chest. He had grown accustomed to the world underestimating him simply because he was a single dad. He had learned long ago that proving anything to people like this was an exercise in futility. "No," he said, his tone even but firm. "I travel with him because I have to. He's my son." The man snorted, shaking his head. "Well, I suppose some of us have more important things to do than babysit on a plane. Must be exhausting, huh?" His smirk was predatory, the kind that drew invisible lines of class and judgment. James felt his chest tighten, a familiar mix of shame and anger rising. He wanted to lash out, to expose this man for the shallow, entitled fool he clearly was. But he didn't. He just sat, silently enduring, counting the minutes until the flight ended. The boy stirred beside him, a soft whimper breaking the oppressive air. James reached over, brushing his son's hair from his forehead. "It's okay, buddy. Go back to sleep," he murmured, his voice a tether between the chaos outside and the fragile world he tried to maintain for his son. The man across from him rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed by this display of tenderness. Hours passed in a blur of hums, announcements, and the occasional cough or shout from other passengers. James tried to focus on the small comforts he could control, the blanket draped over his son, the steady hum of the cabin, the soft click of his laptop as he tried to catch up on work. And then, without warning, the captain's voice shattered the monotony. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have an emergency situation. If there is anyone on board with military flight training, specifically a fighter pilot, please identify yourself immediately." The words hung in the air like a sudden storm. James felt his stomach drop, the hum of the plane now replaced by a deafening silence. People murmured, some looking around in confusion, others scanning the aisles with a flicker of panic in their eyes. The man across from him straightened, his smug expression faltering for the first time. James's mind raced. Emergency? Fighter pilot? His heart pounded, not just from fear but from a strange, electric surge of purpose. Memories he had tried to bury for years, the grueling training, the missions, the discipline, flashed through his mind. He had never wanted to return to that life, never wanted to rely on the instincts drilled into him by fear and responsibility. And yet, here it was, calling him back. "I can help," he said quietly, almost to himself, then louder when he noticed the captain's gaze sweeping the cabin. "I'm trained. I'm a pilot." The man across from him stared in disbelief, his earlier arrogance replaced by shock. "Wait, you were in the military." His voice cracked slightly. James nodded, his eyes steady, but his mind was still a storm of conflicting thoughts. Could he handle whatever awaited them? What if this was a threat beyond anything he had faced before? But most of all, the anger he had suppressed for the man across from him, the patronizing CEO, flared again. He felt a surge of moral satisfaction knowing that in this moment, the man who had mocked him for his responsibilities as a father would see him differently. The captain's voice came again, urgent and taut. "We need someone on the flight deck immediately. It's a mechanical issue, and we may need emergency maneuvers to stabilize the plane. Please, anyone with training. Now." James stood, his son clutching his hand tightly. The boy's eyes were wide, both terrified and proud. "Daddy," he whispered. "I've got this," James said, kneeling to press a kiss to his son's forehead. "Stay right here, okay? I'll be back soon." The man across from him muttered something under his breath, a mix of disbelief and unease, but James didn't hear it. He moved quickly, guided by instinct and a muscle memory that had never truly faded. The aisle seemed impossibly long, each step a heartbeat closer to whatever danger awaited in the cockpit. Inside the flight deck, the tension was palpable. The co-pilot's hands flew over the controls, but the strain on their faces betrayed the seriousness of the situation. "We can't maintain altitude. We need immediate corrective action," the captain said, his voice tight. James's mind analyzed, calculated, and moved before his thoughts even fully formed. He positioned himself at the controls, feeling the familiar weight and resistance, the subtle vibrations beneath his fingertips. His body remembered every drill, every maneuver, every mission. And yet, the personal stakes, the small boy waiting just a few rows back, added a layer of intensity no training could simulate. Minutes stretched into an eternity as the plane shuddered, banking sharply, warning alarms blaring in his ears. Sweat dripped down James's temple, his knuckles white against the controls, but he remained focused. Every instinct, every split-second decision mattered. Outside, passengers clutched their seats, some crying, others silent in disbelief. The man across from James stared, his mouth slightly open, realization dawning. For once, his privileged world had collided with reality, and he had no shield to protect him. James's heart pounded, not just from fear, but from a deep, simmering anger he had carried for years, anger at a world that underestimated him, that judged him for his love and responsibility toward his son. And yet, beneath it all, a strange sense of vindication. Hey, in the cockpit, he was more than a single dad. He was someone who could protect, who could act decisively when it mattered most. As the plane steadied, the shuddering slowly abating, James allowed himself a brief glance at the passengers. Relief was written on faces, some stunned into silence, others whispering frantic thanks. And in that fleeting moment, the weight of personal betrayal, the daily, quiet slights, the judgment he endured, seemed almost insignificant against the raw reality of life and death. But even as adrenaline faded, an uneasy thought nagged at him. Emergencies revealed more than courage. They revealed character, and sometimes they revealed secrets hidden behind the polished veneers of ordinary life. James returned to his seat, his son's small hand slipping into his own. The man across from him avoided his gaze, a subtle acknowledgement that the roles had shifted, if only temporarily. But James knew the real storm was still to come, not in the clouds above, but in the quiet betrayals, half-truths, and hidden lies waiting for the plane to touch down. The flight resumed its course, and James sat back, exhausted but alert, aware that the moment of relief was temporary. The world outside the cockpit had not changed. People still judged, people still lied, and people still betrayed. And in his heart, a premonition whispered that his own confrontation with betrayal, personal, intimate, unavoidable, was about to begin. The cabin lights dimmed slightly for the evening, the hum of the engines filling the space with a deceptive calm. James watched his son's breathing slow, soft and steady, and felt a surge of protective love. He had faced fear before, but the fear of losing trust, the fear of discovering a truth that could shatter his world, was entirely different. And somewhere, deep inside, he knew that the journey ahead would demand not just courage, but clarity, and a confrontation with the heart's darkest vulnerabilities. The plane touched down with a shudder, tires screeching against the wet tarmac, and the cabin erupted into cautious applause. James gripped his son's hand tightly, feeling the tension slowly drain from his body, replaced by a hollow exhaustion that settled deep in his bones. Around him, passengers muttered thanks to the captain and James, though some couldn't quite meet his gaze, as if the sudden revelation of his capability had unsettled the world they had comfortably assumed. He guided his son out of the seat, draping a protective arm around him as they moved down the aisle. The man who had mocked him sat stiffly, his face pale, lips pressed together, the arrogance stripped away, replaced by a wary respect, or perhaps fear. James didn't bother acknowledging him. There was nothing to gain. The victory wasn't for show. It was for survival, for the quiet affirmation that he could protect what mattered most. Outside, rain slicked the runway, droplets streaking the windows of the jet bridge. James's phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it at first, thinking it would be a work call he couldn't take, but when it buzzed again, persistent, he glanced at the screen. The name made his stomach knot. Claire. He froze, thumb hovering over the screen. His ex-wife. The woman who had once been the center of his world, the mother of his son, and, as he had recently suspected, perhaps the orchestrator of a betrayal that had left him questioning everything about their marriage. He hadn't spoken to her much since the divorce, the contact limited to school events, birthday reminders, and occasional updates about his son. But her calls were different. Urgent, insistent, heavy with unspoken tension. James pressed ignore and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He forced his attention to the small hand gripping his own, the boy's innocent trust tethering him to the moment. He couldn't let Claire's shadow spoil this fragile calm. Not yet. The airport was chaotic. People jostled past, luggage wheels rattling over tiles, announcements echoing off the terminal walls. James felt a growing unease, an itch in the back of his mind that whispered this calm was temporary. The flight, the crisis in the cockpit, had been a distraction, but the real storm, the one that would strike inside the walls of ordinary life, was waiting. He collected their bags from a carousel, the routine mundane movements failing to ground him against the gnawing tension that had begun to coil in his chest. His mind replayed moments from the last few months, subtle oddities he had once dismissed. A late meeting she said was work-related, a text left unanswered, an evasive tone in her voice when he asked simple questions. At the time, he had rationalized, had forced himself to trust a person he had once loved. But now the pattern of small betrayals whispered louder, each one a thread in a web he had tried desperately to ignore. The drive home was a blur. Rain-slick streets reflected the city lights, a kaleidoscope of gold and crimson smears across the windshield. His son, exhausted from the adrenaline and unfamiliar surroundings, slept against his shoulder, small snores punctuating the rhythmic swish of the wipers. James wanted to believe that the night could end here, that they could step into the familiar warmth of their apartment and leave the turbulence behind. But he knew better. Betrayal rarely arrived announced. It crept in silently, disguised as routine, until it tore through the trust he had so painstakingly built. Back in the apartment, he set his son up with a small snack, brushing crumbs off the counter as he watched the boy's innocent curiosity return, the cloud of fear from the flight slowly lifting. James smiled, a fragile thing, but it didn't last long. The unanswered call from Claire lingered, an echo in the quiet apartment. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the burn settling in his chest, a brief shield against the gnawing anxiety. He had always relied on clarity, on logic, on facing problems directly. But trust was different. It was messy, emotional, and fragile, easily shattered by half-truths, omissions, and betrayal. His phone buzzed again. Another call, another text. He finally picked it up. "James, we need to talk. It's urgent. Can you come over?" Claire's voice was tight, strained, carrying a weight that made his stomach twist. He froze, words stuck in his throat. Something about her tone set off alarms in his mind. He had learned to read subtleties, the way someone's voice trembled, the hesitation before a sentence, the little lies embedded in the cadence of speech. She sounded panicked, afraid. But of what and why him? I don't know, Claire. Can you tell me what this is about?" His voice was cautious, measured, though a tremor betrayed the storm of emotions beneath. "Please, just come. I can't explain over the phone. It's important. Tonight." James ended the call, heart hammering. He debated for a moment, weighing the risks, the instincts, the intuition that had served him well in crises before. Something about her insistence didn't sit right. But the thought of avoiding it, of letting doubt fester, felt heavier. He nodded to himself. He would go. Later that evening, he parked outside Claire's apartment complex. The rain had stopped, leaving the street slick and reflective. His son was asleep, safely with his neighbor. He couldn't risk involving him in what might be a confrontation steeped in emotional upheaval. James climbed the stairs, each step echoing the tension tightening in his chest. She opened the door before he could knock, her face pale, eyes wide, guilt, or was it fear, etched across her features. "James," she said, voice trembling. I didn't want you to find out this way." "What are you talking about?" he asked, the word sharper than intended. Something in her demeanor, in the hesitation, in the heaviness between them, set his nerves on edge. Claire stepped aside, motioning him in. The apartment was dim, the shadows of the evening long and stretching across the walls. He noticed the untouched wine glasses, the unopened letters on the counter, a faint perfume lingering that wasn't familiar. I made a mistake, she began, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen. I never thought you'd find out this way. James's chest tightened. The familiar nausea of betrayal began to coil inside him, tightening with each word. Claire, what are you saying? His voice was low, controlled, but beneath it simmered anger, hurt, disbelief. She met his gaze, eyes glistening. I've been seeing someone else. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought maybe I could fix it before you ever knew. But I couldn't. And now, her voice faltered. Now. The word hung in the room like a guillotine suspended over his heart. James felt as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It was tangible, visceral, wrapped in the person he had once trusted most. He wanted to scream, to rage, to hurl accusations across the room. But he didn't. He let the shock settle, let the cold, hard truth settle in. His mind raced, replaying every subtle deviation, every excuse, every omission. And then the anger rose, hot and sharp, cutting through the numbness. You've been lying to me. His voice was quiet but deadly. All this time. Claire nodded, tears spilling freely now. I didn't know how to stop. I wanted to love you, but I messed up. I was weak. I'm sorry, James. I truly am. James's hands clenched into fists at his sides, not from a desire to hurt her, but from the internal war raging inside him. Love and trust tangled with betrayal and anger. He had faced death in the cockpit, crises that could snap life in an instant, yet this intimate, personal devastation felt more impossible to navigate than any storm he had flown through. And in the quiet aftermath, standing in the dim apartment, James realized that surviving emergencies in life was one thing. Surviving betrayal, the erosion of trust, the shattering of the heart, was something entirely different. The night stretched ahead, heavy with questions he didn't yet have answers to, and James knew the confrontation, the reckoning, was only beginning. James left Claire's apartment feeling hollow, the rain-slicked streets reflecting the turmoil inside him. The city lights blurred through the windshield as he drove, but the world outside was irrelevant. Nothing mattered except the jagged realization that the person he had loved, trusted, and built a life with had fractured that trust beyond repair. His mind replayed every conversation, every subtle avoidance, every excuse he had ever made. He had rationalized things at the time, busy schedules, stress, miscommunication. But now the truth crashed down on him like a tidal wave. The betrayal wasn't just an abstract notion. It was a living, breathing reality, alive in the choices she had made while he had carried their son, worked tirelessly, and tried to build a stable life. By the time he returned home, the apartment was dark and silent. His son slept peacefully, unaware of the emotional earthquake his father had endured. James paused in the doorway, staring at the small figure curled under a blanket. The innocence in that sleeping face was a cool reminder of the fragility of trust, of how easily the world could fracture and leave him unmoored. He knelt beside the bed, brushing a hand across his son's hair, willing himself to stay composed, to be strong. Strength. That was what he needed now. He had faced life-and-death situations before, navigated crises where a single misstep could end everything. But this betrayal was different. There were no rules, no procedures, no checklist to follow. Just raw emotion and a moral calculus that felt impossible to solve. James poured himself a glass of water, pacing the small apartment, trying to make sense of the whirlwind inside him. Anger coiled like a snake, hot and threatening. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand answers. But there was something deeper than anger, a sharp, painful ache of heartbreak that gnawed at his chest. This was someone who had shared his life, shared his dreams, shared his son, and yet had allowed deceit to fester until it exploded. He remembered the subtle signs he had brushed off. The late nights he claimed were work-related but were never explained. The vague references to colleagues who never seemed to exist. The furtive phone calls, the nervous glances, the sudden irritability when he asked simple questions. At the time, He had rationalized, had silenced the suspicion with reassurances to himself. Now, every suppressed doubt burned like embers, proving he had been right all along. Sleep was impossible. He paced the apartment, each step a drumbeat of unrest, until exhaustion finally claimed him. Even then, dreams offered no reprieve. In the restless hours of the night, he saw her face, her confessions, the subtle ways she had smiled while hiding truths from him. Each image twisted, fractured, a reflection of the fractured trust he now carried. Morning came with the weight of inevitability. James's son was already awake, rubbing his eyes and asking for breakfast. James responded mechanically, a hollow smile plastered on his face, careful not to let the emotional wreckage spill into the child's world. He prepared eggs and toast, forcing conversation, trying to anchor both of them to the routine. His son's laughter, the small triumphs of normality, were fragile lifelines in a sea of emotional chaos. After school drop-off, James returned to the apartment and finally allowed himself to sit, to confront the storm he had been suppressing. He opened his laptop and stared at the screen without reading. Emails, work assignments, bills, all mundane, all irrelevant in the face of personal betrayal. His mind churned, circling questions he had no answers for. Why? How could someone who claimed to love him, who had shared life and child, do this? Was it weakness, desire, cruelty, or some complicated mixture of human imperfection? He thought of Claire, sitting in her apartment, confessing with trembling voice. The guilt in her eyes, the tears streaming freely. It was a contradiction. She had loved him, or at least a version of him, but she had betrayed that love. He tried to reconcile the pieces, but the puzzle refused to form a coherent picture. Trust, once shattered, did not mend easily. James's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He froze, heart hammering. Who could it be? He hadn't expected anyone. Cautiously, he opened it to find a delivery person holding a small package. No signature required, just a plain box with his name on it. Confused, he took it inside, setting it on the kitchen counter. Inside was a small envelope and a USB drive. The envelope contained a single note in Claire's handwriting. You need to see this. It's not what you think, but you need to know the truth. James's hand shook. He looked at the USB, then back at the note. His gut clenched. What truth could justify this betrayal? What secrets were buried so deep that only this drive could reveal them? He had faced uncertainty before, had risked everything in the cockpit, but this felt like stepping into an emotional minefield. The rest of the day blurred. He paced, drank coffee he barely tasted, stared out the window as the city pulsed with oblivious life. His son returned from school, chattering about playground adventures, friends, and homework, but James could only nod, smile faintly, and listen, all while feeling the weight of the unknown pressing in. Finally, after his son had gone to bed, James sat at the desk and plugged in the USB drive. The screen flickered, then a video began to play. His breath caught as familiar faces appeared. People he knew, people he had trusted, all entangled in a web of deceit that he hadn't fully anticipated. The video was fragmentary, edited, and yet unmistakable. There were conversations, messages, clandestine meetings, all pointing toward a betrayal far deeper than mere infidelity. There were hints of manipulation, secret dealings, and a network of lies that had involved Claire in ways he hadn't imagined. His heart raced, anger spiking, but so did something darker, fear. Fear that the world he had known, the life he had built, was a fragile illusion, easily shattered. James leaned back, mind spinning. The betrayal wasn't simple. It wasn't a matter of love lost or desire misdirected. It was complicated, layered, and personal. And somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the anger and heartbreak, a plan began to form. He would uncover every detail. He would confront the lies, the secrets, the hidden truths. He owed that to himself, to his son, to the life they had fought so hard to maintain. And as he stared at the flickering screen, the shadows of the apartment growing long in the dim light, James understood that the journey ahead would demand everything he had: courage, intelligence, restraint, and a willingness to face the most painful truths imaginable. Betrayal had entered his life like a storm, and he had no choice but to navigate it, no matter the cost. The next morning, James woke with a tightness in his chest that refused to loosen. The video from the USB had replayed in his mind repeatedly through the night. Fragmentary images etched into memory, hushed conversations, glances laden with intent, messages that weren't meant for him. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the liquid bitter, grounding him only slightly as his thoughts swirled uncontrollably. He knew he couldn't confront Claire without understanding the full scope of the deception. The betrayal felt like an invisible chain, constricting, reminding him that trust was no longer a shield. It was a vulnerability. And yet, he had questions burning in him that demanded answers. Why had she done it? How long had this been going on? Was any of it real? He felt a grim determination settling in his chest. He needed clarity, no matter how painful. Sitting at the kitchen table, James began analyzing the files on the USB drive. Each clip and message seemed disconnected at first, but slowly a pattern emerged. Claire's name appeared repeatedly in contexts he hadn't imagined. Clandestine meetings with people whose motives were opaque, conversations that hinted at lies and manipulation. There were moments captured where she spoke to someone with urgency, apologizing, promising loyalty, but always under duress, as if trapped in a world he couldn't see. James felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just about a failed relationship. There were larger forces at play, strands of secrecy and coercion intertwined with personal betrayal. He wondered if she had ever been entirely free to make choices, or if circumstances had cornered her into decisions that hurt him so profoundly. The question gnawed at him. Was this deliberate cruelty, or the desperate act of someone caught in a situation too complex to explain in words? His anger, which had been sharp and immediate, now mingled with a cautious curiosity. He had to know. He had to understand before he could decide what to do next. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of the spiral. It was Claire. "James, please, can we talk?" Her voice was strained, fragile. He stared at the screen, weighing his options. Every instinct screamed caution, yet a part of him needed human explanation, needed to hear it from her lips. "Fine," he said, voice measured. "Meet me at the park near my apartment. 1 hour." When she arrived, the tension between them was almost palpable. Claire's eyes were red from crying, but there was a sharpness there too, a flicker of guilt and fear. She held herself stiffly, as if bracing for a storm. "I watched the video," James began without preamble, his voice calm but edged with controlled fury. "Explain everything. Now." Claire's lips trembled. "James, I didn't want it to get this far. I was trying to protect you, to protect us. But someone else was involved, and I had no choice." James felt his hands clench, the frustration rising. "No choice? You betrayed me. You betrayed our son. You let me live in ignorance while everything was crumbling. And now you tell me it wasn't your choice." Tears fell freely down her cheeks. "I know it looks that way. I know it seems like I did it for myself. But it wasn't. You have to believe me. I never wanted to hurt you. I couldn't stop it. And when I tried to tell you, the timing was never right, or I was afraid it would destroy everything." James felt the room tilt. Fear, anger, love, and heartbreak collided violently inside him. The complexity of her situation didn't erase the pain. It layered it, making every emotion sharper, every betrayal more nuanced. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside. "Start from the beginning. Who? What? Why?" Claire hesitated, searching for words that might not exist. "There's a man, James. Someone connected to the business world. Powerful, manipulative. He threatened me, my career, even our lives if I didn't cooperate. He forced me into meetings to convey information I shouldn't have. I tried to resist. I really did. But it became impossible. Every step I took, he monitored. Every move I made was calculated. And I lied to protect you, to protect us." James's mind spun. 1,000 questions collided with a gnawing realization. The betrayal wasn't entirely of her choosing. The personal hurt was compounded by the shadow of coercion, of danger that he hadn't seen coming. And yet, even as the story unfolded, a part of him recoiled. Lies, even forced, were lies. Trust had been fractured, and no explanation could fully mend that. "You expect me to forgive this?" he asked quietly, almost rhetorically. To understand that every lie, every betrayal, was supposed to be for my good. Claire shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to know the truth before it was too late. You have to understand, James. I love you. I always have. But I was trapped, and I had no power over the circumstances. James turned away, staring at the empty expanse of the park beyond the railing. The city lights blurred in the misty evening, distant and cold. His emotions roiled. Love battled betrayal. Guilt collided with anger, and the image of his son's innocent face anchored him to reality. He couldn't let the emotional chaos destroy the stability he had fought to create for their child. Finally, he spoke. I need time. I need space. I need to figure out what this means for us, for me, for him. Claire nodded, understanding the unspoken command. She lingered for a moment, as if trying to memorize his face, then walked away into the shadows, leaving James alone with his thoughts. The silence that followed was deafening. James sank onto a bench, head in hands. The storm had not passed, it had only shifted. Betrayal had been revealed, but the layers of secrecy, coercion, and half-truths made clarity elusive. Every instinct screamed caution, every emotion demanded confrontation. He realized that this was only the beginning. The USB drive, the videos, Claire's confession. There were pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a larger picture he could not yet see. But one thing was certain, the path ahead would be treacherous, and navigating it required not just courage, but precision, strategy, and the willingness to face truths that could fracture him further. James rose from the bench, the night air cold against his skin. He felt the first stirrings of resolve, the quiet, determined pulse of someone who had survived crises before and would survive this. Betrayal had entered his life, raw and unrelenting, but he refused to be broken by it. Not yet. Not ever. James returned home that night, the city streets glistening with under a moonless sky. The apartment was dark, quiet, but the air felt heavy with anticipation. He sat at the kitchen table, the USB drive still plugged into his laptop, and opened the folders again. This time, he was looking for patterns, connections, inconsistencies, anything that could explain not only Claire's actions but the larger web she had hinted at. Hours passed. Files revealed meetings he had never known about, conversations that hinted at coercion, and hints of manipulation from individuals whose power extended beyond the personal sphere. Every clip was a fragment, a puzzle piece, but the edges were jagged. The picture wasn't yet clear, but it was forming, and the implications were staggering. James leaned back, rubbing his eyes. He felt the familiar burn of exhaustion, but sleep was impossible. This was no longer a simple emotional crisis. This was a labyrinth of deception, and he was determined to navigate it without losing himself. The next day, he began reaching out cautiously. Old contacts, people he had trusted, colleagues who might have insight into the individuals Claire had described. Every call, every conversation, added another thread to the tangled web. Some confirmed suspicions, others provided new angles, but all pointed to the same disturbing truth. Claire had been ensnared in a network of manipulation that extended far beyond their personal lives. Yet even as the investigation deepened, James could not escape the personal betrayal. Every revelation was a double-edged sword. It explained, yet it wounded. It justified, yet it hurt. He found himself walking a delicate line between understanding and anger, forgiveness and rage. His emotions were a storm, raw and unpredictable. One evening, while reviewing footage of one of the clandestine meetings, James noticed something chilling. A familiar logo in the background, a subtle symbol that connected Claire's coerced interactions to a corporation he had once trusted. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The betrayal was larger, systemic, and more dangerous than he had imagined. He realized that Claire's deception had not been born solely of desire or weakness, it had been survival. And that realization complicated everything. James's anger remained, sharp and visceral, but it was now tempered by the knowledge that the human element, the fear, the coercion, the impossible choices, had shaped every decision. He called Claire that night, his voice steady but measured. I need more details. I need names, places, everything. This isn't just about us anymore. There's a bigger picture, and I need to see it. Claire hesitated, then agreed. I'll tell you everything. I've been too scared to speak before, but you need the truth. You deserve that much." Over the next several days, Claire revealed the full extent of the manipulation. Secret meetings with influential figures, threats veiled in legal and financial language, the constant monitoring that left her with no room for honest choice. She had lied, yes, but each lie was a desperate attempt to maintain a semblance of control, to protect her family from forces that had no concern for personal morality. James listened, absorbing every detail, every confession, every nuance. The betrayal was still there, still painful, but it was now enmeshed with fear, coercion, and survival. His emotions were tangled in ways he had not anticipated. He felt anger, yes, but also a reluctant empathy, a desire to understand the human complexity that had led to the lies. But there was no time to dwell on emotion alone. The network of manipulation, hinted at in the videos and Clay's confessions, was dangerous. James realized that exposing it could have consequences beyond their personal lives, consequences that might reach into legal and professional arenas, and possibly even personal safety. He began organizing the information meticulously, creating timelines, mapping connections, and identifying points of leverage. Every detail mattered. Every omission could be fatal. The stakes were high, and he was determined to approach this like a mission, methodically, strategically, without letting personal emotion cloud judgment. One evening, while reviewing a particularly revealing file, James noticed a series of encrypted communications. The sender and recipient were masked, but the content was clear enough to suggest manipulation and coercion at a high level. He realized that the betrayal extended beyond Claire and their relationship. It was part of a larger, systemic web designed to ensnare people like them, people whose lives could be destabilized to serve the interests of those in power. The implications hit him like a punch to the chest. Betrayal, deceit, and manipulation had operated on multiple levels, personal, emotional, and systemic. Every choice Claire had made, every omission, had been shaped not just by human weakness but by calculated influence. And that realization made the emotional impact even more profound. James felt a mix of vindication, fury, and sorrow. He had faced life-threatening situations in the cockpit, navigated crises that could end in death, but this intimate, layered betrayal was something no training could fully prepare him for. And yet, he had survived. He had endured. And now, he had clarity. He knew the next steps would be critical. Confrontations would have to be precise, careful, and deliberate. Exposure would have to be strategic. And amidst all this, he had to maintain his role as protector, not just of himself and his son, but of Claire, who was now entangled in consequences beyond her making. That night, James sat at his desk, surrounded by evidence, timelines, and encrypted files, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Betrayal had entered his life like a storm, raw and unrelenting, but he had learned to navigate storms before. He would survive this, too. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the exhaustion and the anger, a flicker of resolve burned. He would uncover every truth, confront every deception, and reclaim the world that had been fractured by lies. The next morning, James awoke with a single, unyielding thought. He could no longer remain passive. The betrayal he had endured, while tangled with coercion and circumstance, demanded action. It wasn't just about confronting Claire anymore. It was about uncovering the full extent of the network that had ensnared them both. He spent hours mapping connections from the USB and the files Claire had provided. Every name, every location, every encrypted message became a node in a sprawling web. Patterns emerged, revealing meetings, transfers, and communications that suggested careful planning, influence, and exploitation. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this network operated with impunity, using fear and deception to manipulate people like Claire. Yet amidst the strategic mapping, James could not ignore the personal betrayal gnawing at him. Claire's choices, no matter the coercion, had hurt him deeply. The trust they had shared, the foundation of their relationship, had been fractured. Every memory he had cherished, every promise exchanged, now carried the weight of uncertainty. Could he ever forgive? Could he ever trust her fully again? The questions twisted inside him, a gnawing ache that no methodical planning could soothe. He needed answers, not just for clarity, but for control. Control had been stripped from them, and he would reclaim it. He began making calls to contact he trusted implicitly, former colleagues from his military days, cybersecurity experts, and legal advisors who specialize in corporate investigations. He presented only fragments at first, careful not to reveal too much of Claire's involvement until he had confirmed the facts. Hours blurred into days as James orchestrated a careful strategy. Each step was deliberate, confirming identities, tracking meetings, and analyzing digital footprints. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous the web appeared. The network was sophisticated, with layers of obfuscation, but James's training, both in the cockpit and in life, gave him an edge. He was accustomed to navigating chaos, making decisions under pressure, and calculating risks with precision. Through it all, Claire reached out sporadically. Her messages were short, tinged with guilt and fear. She had not anticipated the full extent of the investigation or the tenacity James possessed. Yet each interaction reminded him of the human element behind the deception, the woman he had loved, whose choices had been shaped by fear, manipulation, and circumstance. One evening, James received an anonymous tip via secure email. It contained detailed logs of communications between Claire and the individuals who had coerced her. The information was damning, not just in terms of betrayal, but also in the potential danger it posed to their lives. Someone was watching, monitoring, and ensuring that a deception continued to serve their interests. James felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. This was no longer just a personal confrontation. It had become a high-stakes game of strategy and survival. Every decision carried weight, and missteps could have consequences far beyond heartbreak. He decided it was time for a direct confrontation with those involved. Using the information he had gathered, he planned a meeting, carefully choosing a neutral location where he could assert control. Every precaution was taken. He monitored communications, coordinated with trusted contacts, and prepared contingencies for every potential scenario. But even as he strategized, the emotional undercurrent remained strong. He thought of his son, asleep in the next room, innocent and trusting. The child's world depended on his ability to navigate the storm with both strength and prudence. Every action, every decision, had to be measured. Failure was not an option. The day of the meeting arrived. James felt a mixture of anticipation and tension as he approached the location, a small, nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The hum of traffic and distant sirens seemed to underscore the danger of the moment. He moved carefully, aware that this confrontation could escalate quickly. Inside, the individuals he had traced through digital evidence were already present, their demeanor calm but wary. James entered deliberately, exuding the calm authority of someone who had faced crises before. Eyes met, silent acknowledgments passed, and the tension in the room became almost tangible. "I know everything," James began, his voice steady, carrying the weight of someone who had seen and survived far worse than corporate threats. "I know what's been happening. I know how Claire was manipulated. I know the games you've been playing." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Faces shifted, subtle movements betraying the recognition of his capability and resolve. For the first time, the manipulators realized they were no longer in control. James continued, systematically exposing the web of deceit, outlining the evidence he had gathered. Every step was calculated, precise, leaving no room for ambiguity. His anger was controlled, channeled into a laser focus that cut through the tension like a blade. And yet, even in the midst of confrontation, the personal betrayal lingered, a shadow over the proceedings. He remembered Claire's tearful confessions, her whispered apologies, the fear that had driven her to act against him. Anger and empathy warred within him, each emotion demanding attention, each choice shaping the outcome of the moment. By the end of the meeting, James had achieved clarity and leverage. The manipulators understood that their control had ended, at least for now. He had reclaimed authority, but the personal cost was still present, unresolved. The betrayal, layered and complex, had left scars that would not heal quickly. Driving home, James reflected on the duality of the day. He had confronted the external threat with precision and courage, yet the internal storm, betrayal, heartbreak, and the erosion of trust remained. He knew the journey toward emotional resolution would be long, filled with challenges, introspection, and difficult choices. That night, he sat beside his sleeping son, feeling the weight of responsibility and the fragility of human relationships. The events of the past weeks had revealed truths about courage, trust, and deception. He had survived life-threatening situations before, but surviving betrayal required a different kind of strength, patience, discernment, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths without losing oneself. James knew this was only the beginning. The web of manipulation had been exposed, but the personal reckoning, the confrontation with betrayal, forgiveness, and trust was still ahead. And as he watched his son sleep, he vowed to navigate it with the same determination, precision, and courage that had brought him this far. The days that followed the confrontation were strange, almost surreal. James returned home each night feeling the residual tension like a weight pressing against his chest, but the manipulators no longer had direct control. That victory should have felt like relief, yet it was hollow. Betrayal, after all, left scars that no external triumph could erase. Claire tried to reach out. Her texts were careful, measured, almost pleading. "I know I hurt you. I never wanted this. Can we talk?" James read each one, heart thrumming with conflicting emotions. The anger he felt was sharp and immediate, but so was a residual bond, the love he had once felt, and the empathy he had for her trapped, terrified, and manipulated. He knew he could not respond impulsively. Trust had been fractured, and the path to understanding, or forgiveness, would require patience, deliberation, and clarity. Every step he took now had consequences not only for him but for his son, who remained blissfully unaware of the storm that had been swirling around their lives. At work, James found it difficult to focus. His mind kept drifting to the USB files, the manipulations, the secrecy, and Claire's face when she confessed. Every moment of normalcy felt fragile, as if one wrong word or action could send the world collapsing back into chaos. Even his colleagues noticed his distracted demeanor, though none could understand the magnitude of what he was navigating. Late one evening, he received a call from one of the contacts he had used during the investigation. "James, there's something you need to see. We tracked some recent communications, and they indicate the manipulators might not be finished. There's a new thread, people you don't know, messages encrypted in ways we've never seen." James's chest tightened. Relief from the previous victory was gone, replaced by an uneasy vigilance. The network had been disrupted, yes, but it had not been eliminated. The betrayal, and the danger intertwined with it, was far from over. He decided to confront Claire directly, needing to hear her voice, to gauge the sincerity of her confessions, and to determine whether the danger still extended to her. They met in the quiet of a park, far from the eyes of anyone who might be observing. Her expression was strained, haunted, yet there was a vulnerability he had not seen in years. "I didn't want you to get dragged into this any further," she said quietly, her hands clasped tightly. "I tried to fix things, but I can't undo what's happened." James remained silent, letting her words settle. Every instinct told him to be cautious, yet he could not ignore the complexity of the situation, the fear, the coercion, and the desperate attempt to protect him and their son. "I need to know you're safe," he said finally, "and that you won't be manipulated again. I need honesty, Claire. No more secrets." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I swear, no more secrets. I need you to believe me." James exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Belief would take time, but he recognized the truth in her words. The manipulative web had threatened their lives, their trust, and their world. But here, in this small park, there was a moment of clarity, a chance to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. Yet, even as they spoke, James could not shake the residual fear. The manipulators might have been temporarily contained, but the damage to trust, the betrayal, and the emotional scars remained. He realized that the path forward would require vigilance, patience, and a careful balancing of love and caution. Over the next few weeks, James focused on rebuilding. He strengthened the boundaries around his personal life, monitored communications more carefully, and ensured that his son's world remained as untouched by the chaos as possible. But every decision, every interaction with Claire, carried the weight of the past betrayal. He found himself analyzing her every word, every gesture, trying to separate genuine remorse from instinctual defense. One evening, while reviewing new file from his investigation, James noticed a pattern he had overlooked. Small, seemingly insignificant messages that suggested someone was still watching, still orchestrating events from the shadows. A chill ran down his spine. The betrayal wasn't fully over. It had mutated, shifting from direct manipulation to subtle observation, waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew he had to be ready. The confrontation with the manipulators had been just the first step. The real test was navigating the aftermath: trust, personal reconciliation, and the potential resurgence of danger. Every choice now carried layers of consequence: emotional, practical, and moral. That night, James sat beside his sleeping son, hands resting lightly on the boy's small shoulders. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, heavier than any physical danger he had faced. Betrayal was not just a test of courage. It was a test of character, of patience, and of the ability to protect those you love without being consumed by anger or fear. Claire's presence lingered in his thoughts, a reminder of the complexity of human relationships. She had betrayed him, yes, but under duress and manipulation. The path to understanding, forgiveness, or even cautious reconciliation would be slow, painstaking, and fraught with emotional peril. James realized that survival in life-and-death scenarios had trained him for instant decisions and action, but surviving betrayal required something entirely different: reflection, discernment, and the resilience to face the heart's darkest vulnerabilities. And as he watched his son sleep peacefully, James made a quiet vow. He would navigate the storm with precision, courage, and care. He would uncover every hidden truth, confront every lingering deception, and ensure that betrayal, in all its forms, would not dictate the future of their lives. The journey ahead was uncertain, the emotional stakes higher than ever, but James knew one thing with clarity: he would not allow the past, the lies, or the betrayals to define him or his family. He would face them head-on, with every ounce of strength, intelligence, and heart he possessed. The nights had grown restless. James no longer slept without a lingering sense of vigilance, every creak of the apartment, every distant siren, sharpening his senses. The manipulators had been contained for now, but the encrypted messages, the subtle threats, and the knowledge that he was being watched made calm impossible. Every shadow seemed to whisper, every notification carried a hidden weight. Claire remained cautious, contacting him sparingly, aware of the precarious balance between explanation and protection. She had begun to rebuild trust slowly, providing details, clarifying timelines, and offering transparency in ways she never had before. And yet, James's mind refused to let him relax. He knew that betrayal left marks not only on the heart but also on perception itself. Every action was scrutinized, every word dissected. One evening, as he reviewed new footage and logs from the investigation, James noticed something that made his pulse spike: a pattern of travel and communication that suggested someone was preparing to act. Not an attack on him personally, but a move to regain control over Claire, to manipulate her once more, and perhaps draw him into a trap. His instincts, honed from years in high-stakes situations, kicked in. He began cross-referencing locations, communications, and timestamps. The manipulators were methodical, precise, and now aware that he was a threat. Any misstep could have catastrophic consequences. James realized he needed allies. He contacted his former military colleagues, trusted private investigators, and cybersecurity experts. Every detail was shared, every move calculated. Surveillance was established, digital footprints monitored, and contingency plans drawn. For the first time in weeks, he felt a measure of control, though the tension never truly left his chest. Despite the danger, James also had to manage the personal fallout. He met Claire in a quiet cafe, their interactions deliberate, controlled. She spoke with honesty, recounting meetings, threats, and coercion in painstaking detail. Each revelation was a double-edged sword. It clarified her actions, yet reopened old wounds. "I never wanted you to think I did this willingly," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Every lie, every omission, it was survival. I was trapped, and I didn't know how to break free without destroying everything, including you and him." James studied her, noting the tremor in her hands, the strain in her eyes. He wanted to believe her, desperately wanted to see the truth in her words, but the betrayal had carved deep lines in his trust. "I understand fear can drive people to desperate acts," he said cautiously. "But that doesn't erase what happened. We need to rebuild, carefully, and we need to stay safe. They're not done. The next day, James began shadowing Claire discreetly, ensuring she was never alone in vulnerable situations, while continuing his investigation into the manipulators. Every intercepted message, every subtle anomaly, provided another piece of the puzzle. The network was intricate, sprawling, and ruthless. But James's patience, intelligence, and methodical approach were gradually dismantling it. Late one night, a message appeared on his encrypted email account. The content was brief, ominous. You can't stop it. You won't see it coming. The signature was untraceable, the threat chillingly precise. James felt a surge of anger, fear, and determination. He knew the game had escalated. The manipulators were testing him, probing for weaknesses, challenging his resolve. He responded by tightening security, encrypting all communications, and coordinating with experts to trace the message without exposing Claire or himself. Every move was deliberate, every precaution necessary. The stakes were higher than ever, and failure was not an option. Amidst the external threats, the emotional tension between James and Claire remained palpable. They shared moments of quiet connection, fleeting glimpses of the trust and love that had once defined their relationship. But each smile, each conversation, carried the shadow of betrayal. James found himself oscillating between empathy and guardedness, hope and skepticism. One evening, while reviewing new intelligence, James discovered a lead that suggested someone close to Claire had been coerced into participation. The revelation complicated everything. What had seemed like personal betrayal was part of a network that leveraged fear, loyalty, and power to manipulate multiple individuals simultaneously. The implications were profound. James realized the path to resolution would require not only confronting the manipulators, but also understanding the human complexities of coercion, loyalty, and survival. Each person involved had acted under pressure, some knowingly, others as pawns in a larger scheme. The moral landscape was gray, treacherous, and emotionally taxing. James made a decision. He would confront the manipulators again, but this time with precision and patience. The goal was not only to dismantle the network, but also to protect Claire and their son from further harm. Every step had to be calculated, every interaction measured, every risk mitigated. As he sat beside his sleeping son that night, James reflected on the journey so far. Betrayal had entered his life with devastating force, exposing him to fear, heartbreak, and moral ambiguity. But it had also revealed his resilience, his capacity for strategic thinking, and his determination to protect what mattered most. Tomorrow, he would take the next step. The confrontation would be deliberate, controlled, and precise. The network would be dismantled, and the manipulation exposed. And somewhere in the midst of danger and deception, he would confront the lingering question that had haunted him since the first revelation. Could trust ever be rebuilt after betrayal? The night stretched on, heavy with anticipation, yet beneath it, a quiet determination burned. James knew the storm was far from over, but he was ready to navigate it, with clarity, courage, and unwavering resolve. James awoke before dawn, the city still shrouded in mist and silence. Every instinct screamed vigilance. The intelligence he had gathered over the past weeks indicated the manipulators were planning something imminent, a final move to regain control over Claire and, by extension, him. There was no room for error. He reviewed the maps, the communications, and the surveillance feeds one last time. Every exit route, every potential risk, every contingency had been accounted for. James had become hyper-aware, almost predatory, ready to react at the slightest sign of threat. Yet beneath the calm precision, his emotions simmered, anger at the betrayal, fear for his family's safety, and the ever-present tension of the moral landscape he had navigated. Claire arrived shortly before sunrise. She was pale, exhausted from weeks of anxiety and near-constant vigilance, but there was a resolute glint in her eyes. She had faced coercion, manipulation, and her own guilt, yet she showed up, trusting him with her safety. "Are you ready?" James asked, voice steady but low. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I trust you. Let's end this." Together, they approached the location identified in the intercepted communications, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city. James moved with deliberate caution, his military instincts guiding every step. Claire stayed close, her hand brushing against his as a silent reassurance. The shared tension between them spoke volumes. Fear, trust, and the fragile thread of reconciliation woven through weeks of betrayal. Inside, the manipulators were waiting, confident in their perceived advantage. But James was prepared. Surveillance cameras, digital tracking, and strategic positioning had neutralized many of their threats. He stepped forward, voice calm but commanding. "I know everything," he said, each word deliberate. "I know the threats, the coercion, and the manipulation. Your control ends today." The room tensed, the manipulators exchanging glances. They realized that their careful orchestration had been observed and anticipated. James continued, systematically exposing their actions with evidence, timelines, and intercepted communications. Every revelation was precise, calculated to undermine their authority and assert his dominance in the situation. Claire stood beside him, providing corroboration when necessary. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steady as the confrontation progressed. Together, they dismantled the network of manipulation in real time, exposing the lies, coercion, and deceit that had governed their lives for months. The manipulators reacted with anger, desperation, and subtle threats, but James was unflinching. He anticipated every move, countered every tactic, and maintained control of the room with a combination of intellect, strategy, and raw courage. The climax was both external and internal, the physical dismantling of a threat and the emotional confrontation with betrayal, fear, and trust. Finally, the manipulators had no choice but to surrender, their influence broken, their control nullified. James exhaled slowly, the tension easing slightly but not entirely. The battle had been won, but the personal reconciliation, the rebuilding of trust and emotional repair, remained. Later, back at the apartment, James and Claire sat together in quiet reflection. The weight of the past weeks hung between them, yet there was a fragile sense of relief. The manipulators were contained, the threat neutralized, but the emotional landscape was still fraught. "I never wanted to hurt you," Claire said softly, voice choked with emotion. "Everything I did was survival. I hope you can understand that someday." James studied her face, seeing both vulnerability and honesty. The betrayal had been real, devastating, but so had the coercion. Anger and empathy warred within him. Yet beneath it all, a cautious hope emerged. "Trust isn't rebuilt overnight," he said finally. "But we can try, step by step, for him and for us." Claire nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Step by step," she repeated. And as James watched his son sleep, peaceful and unaware, he realized that the true test was not the confrontation with external threats. It was the navigation of human emotion, trust, and resilience. Betrayal had entered their lives like a storm, and though the worst of it was over, the journey toward healing, understanding, and cautious hope had only just begun. The night stretched on, heavy but quieter than it had in weeks. James felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, the quiet assurance that, despite the betrayal, fear, and moral complexity, he had survived, and perhaps, in time, they all could. The morning after the confrontation, sunlight spilled through the blinds, painting the apartment in warm, golden streaks. James stood at the kitchen counter, coffee in hand, staring out the window at a city that seemed ordinary, yet he knew it had shifted irrevocably. The manipulators were neutralized, the threats diminished, but the scars of betrayal ran deep. His son bounded into the kitchen, backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder, a bright grin on his face. "Dad, guess what happened at school today?" The innocence in that voice was a balm, a reminder of what he was fighting for, and what had to be protected at all costs. James knelt, ruffling the boy's hair. "What happened?" Excitement tumbled out. Stories of playground victories, friends, and homework triumphs. For a moment, James allowed himself to be present, to breathe in the simplicity of normalcy, a fragile reprieve from weeks of tension, fear, and heartbreak. Later, Claire arrived, tentative but determined. She carried a small bouquet of flowers, not extravagant, just enough to signal care and the desire to begin again. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of the past weeks, the lies, coercion, fear, and betrayal hung between them. "I know it's complicated," she said softly, placing the flowers on the counter. "I know I've hurt you, and that trust isn't something you can just give back. But I want to try. If you let me. James studied her, the lines of guilt and fear etched across her face, the sincerity in her voice. He thought of the weeks of turmoil, the USB files, the confrontations, the manipulated threats. And yet, he also remembered her courage, the honesty she displayed in the wake of devastation, and the vulnerability that no coercion could erase. Trust has to be rebuilt, he said carefully, and it will take time. Every step matters. But we'll try. For him, for us. Claire nodded, relief mingling with apprehension. They shared a tentative moment of connection, fragile but present, a step toward reconciliation. In the following days, life began to settle into a cautious rhythm. James maintained vigilance, ensuring that lingering threats from the manipulative network could not resurface, while also allowing himself to reclaim small pieces of normalcy, bedtime stories with his son, quiet dinners, and moments of conversation with Claire where honesty and patience guided them. The emotional scars remained. He would not forget the betrayal, nor the fear it had wrought. But he discovered something vital in its wake. Resilience, the capacity to navigate complexity, and the strength to protect those he loved while maintaining his moral compass. One evening, as the three of them sat together in the living room, James reflected quietly. Betrayal had entered their lives like a storm, unpredictable and devastating. But they had weathered it. The manipulators were gone, the immediate threats neutralized, and while trust would never be naive or unguarded again, it could be deliberate, conscious, and cautiously natured. He glanced at Claire, then at his son, and allowed a small, genuine smile to surface. Healing would take time, and the journey would be slow, but it was possible. The storm had passed, leaving scars, yes, but also clarity, perspective, and a renewed understanding of human resilience. Betrayal had shattered trust, but it had not broken him. It had taught him the cost of vigilance, the weight of love, and the complexity of human choice. And in that quiet, sunlit apartment, James understood that survival was not only about confronting danger, it was about confronting the heart, navigating deception, and learning to rebuild, step by step, toward hope. As night fell, he sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with potential pitfalls and challenges, but he felt a sense of grounded purpose. Betrayal had entered their lives, raw and unrelenting. Yet through courage, strategy, and emotional honesty, it could be faced, understood, and ultimately survived. And for the first time in weeks, James allowed himself to believe that trust, fragile, cautious, and deliberate, might one day be fully restored.